Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Nasir Khiliji again. He's an economist. He is a man with many interests, including repairing Mercedes cars. And he has driven from Paris all the way to Lahore, if I remember correctly, in the summer of 1977. So we are dealing with a chap who is a well-rounded individual, a bit like John Maynard Keynes, although he never belonged to the Epicurean Bloomsbury group, although I'm sure he would have liked to. Welcome, Nasir.
Oh, thank you, Atul.
Excellent. Well, Nasir, great to have you back. We are discussing remittances today. But before we do so, why don't you tell us what exactly are remittances?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Remittances, generally, there's a generic definition of remittance, which is basically you remit something, like generally money to someone. So that's the general dictionary meaning of remittances. But in economics, and especially in development economics, they have come to mean they have a particular meaning. And the meaning has to do with residents of one country who live in another country, like a host country, and they send money back to their relatives, friends, or parents back to their home country. And that phenomena, without any quid pro quo, is called remittances in the development literature, in the economic development literature.
So to put it very simply, you're a worker, let's say you're from Turkey, you're working in Germany in the Opel car factory, and you send a percentage of your income to your extended family or immediate family back home, and that would qualify as a remittance.
Exactly.
Brilliant. So what exactly, or what broadly, are the benefits of remittances?
Okay, so remittances, if we were to look at the historical evolution of these remittances, they have to go along with migration flows. So if we go back to post-World War II, prior to that, when people used to go emigrate, like say from England to the USA, they basically came on ships. And generally they didn't look back. So they were escaping, they didn't look back, and they settled in the USA, and they lived here, they made their money, and they never thought of sending money back. And the means were not there either to send money back.
So the same held true if European settlers went to South America, or they went to South Africa, or they went to Australia, or even north of the USA to Canada.
Exactly. So because of the technology, transportation, most of the emigration happened for good without looking back.
So they cut off, sorry to interject, sorry to cut you off actually,
Yeah.
They cut off the umbilical cord with the mothership, with the mother country.
Exactly. So that after World War II, the emigration flows changed dramatically. So, once it all settled down, the first type of emigration flows went from people from Indo-Pak continent who had already were aware of England, Great Britain. So, and there was a demand in England for a lot of labor because of textile mills. So they started importing a lot of workers from Pakistan, India, Kashmir, who were not really doing that well, into Manchester and that areas where their textile mills were located. So that was the first phenomena of migration, where they had the means and they had relatives and they had families that they had left behind, primarily because they wouldn't get visas to bring the whole family. These were just strictly workers who had come to work, and that was it. So they were not allowed to bring families. And given that their families were back home, this whole phenomena of sending money back home became more prevalent.
So just to add on to what you said, the French also imported labor from North Africa. Germany imported labor from Turkey. In fact, they were called Gastarbeiters, which means guest workers. So this was a phenomenon that, yes, happened in the UK. And yes, a lot of people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh went to the UK in that first wave, but also happened through the rest of post-war Europe.
Exactly. So you're right. Germany, all these countries that were developing and were short of labor, they were importing, workers from Turkey, from Africa, from Indo-Pak subcontinent, even from Latin America. As the transportation costs increased, became easier, transportation became more amenable. So these flows of emigration increased primarily for economic reasons, primarily to go and work, but to look back and send money to relatives and family that had been left behind. So over time, this phenomena increased and it became more pronounced, especially in the Gulf oil states when oil prices shot up in 1973.
So let's go back to the benefits and then we can walk through the history.
Yeah.
So the benefits straight off the bat seem to be that the advanced economies got cheaper labor or labor because they were probably short of labor after World War II. And the poor economies managed to get money back. And many families who were left behind suddenly had a higher standard of living. Would that be fair to say? These were the two main benefits?
Absolutely. That's fair to say. So on the one hand, you had a labor short economy managing to get more labor without being, inundated with the welfare costs. So they could import guest workers who would work. So they would, that way they would eliminate the shortage. And by the same token, the workers were able to send money back home and increase the living standard of their families. Yes. So these were the initial, at the micro level, at the individual level, at the family level, these were benefits on both sides. Both countries gained.
Brilliant. So we have talked about the benefits now. What about their downsides? What are the downsides of remittances?
Okay. So initially, like I said, this was at the micro level. You may not think that there's anything harmful about this, where, you have an exchange of workers for money. So a worker comes into the host country, works, sends money back home, so that the country that receives it, the relatives and the family are able to buy more stuff. So they have an extra income and they may be able to maybe purchase the goods from the same host country even that they are buying. So it can work in a very perfect world. But over time, the disadvantages can be, depending on the kind of country you're in and on the scale of the remittances. So if this is like a small phenomena, like not really hurting the balance of payments or the trade position of a country, then there's nothing. This is really very minuscule. But over time, especially in particular types of countries which have had other difficulties, remittances have ended up being sources of earnings or sources of foreign exchange or sources of balance of payment improvement for the country concerned, for poor countries, developing countries. And they become a major source of, think of it as export earnings, although in the balance of payments, these remittances are called unrequited transfers, meaning that there is no quid pro quo. So the money has come back, but you haven't given anything in return. So in other words, the country is getting this flow of funds without having given anything in return. And if this becomes a big source, that can in fact lead of this particular country into an overvalued currency because the foreign currency is coming without anything in return. and it's demanding local currency, which goes up in value. And then since the population is depending on that, they in a way have a reserve wage. They're getting money from abroad. So they may not even feel like working because they're getting money from abroad. So that's one disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have a lowering of the labor participation rate.
Mm-hmm. So let me stop you there. So
Yeah.
there are two things that are happening. Let's say you're a worker, you work in the Opel factory, and you send money back to Turkey. And so what happens is that your family then takes that money which you sent, let's say Deutsche Marks back in the day, or euro now, and you exchange it for lira. So suddenly you're selling euro or Deutsche Mark in the markets. You're putting downward pressure on this currency, and there's upward pressure on the lira. So your own domestic currency is being pushed up. But
Exactly.
But the second thing is that because your family is getting this money from abroad, in effect, they have a minimum wage.
Yes.
So the labor market then clears at a higher price. The cost of labor goes up. So you're getting the classic example of haircuts now costing a bit more, or your
Exactly.
gardener charging a bit more. So it sounds very much like what we studied in university as the Dutch disease.
Exactly.
And explain to our listeners what is the Dutch disease before we get lost in jargon.
So, they're in the present day and age, given the way, like you've described it, remittances have multi-dimensional effects, some positive, some negative, depending on the country concerned and so on. So let's talk about a phenomena called Dutch disease first. It can be, Dutch disease basically comes as the name is given because at one time, Netherlands got this abundant natural gas in the North Sea. And because of that, the natural gas industry became predominant and it drove all the other industries out because everyone was wanting to work for the natural gas industry, basically getting all that money from natural gas. So the other industries, they became less competitive and they were driven out. So Dutch disease is a phenomena where one industry or one dynamic industry ends up becoming so advantageous that it basically drives all the other industries out. They're not profitable at the going prices. For example, think about the labor resource abundant economies. We can think about Russia, for example. Russia is a very big resource abundant economy. So at one time when oil prices were going up, it found that most of the money was flowing in for oil. So all the other sectors were lagging behind. And actually, the automobile industry, other industries were lagging because everyone wanted to work in these resource abundant industries. Similarly, so that's a Dutch disease phenomena where one sector becomes so profitable that it drives all the other sectors out of business. So that phenomena is called Dutch disease. So you can imagine that remittances can end up being like a Dutch disease. So if you have a country that starts getting remittances in a very large amount as a percentage of its foreign exchange earnings, that can drive up the value of its currency so high, just like oil, for example, that all the other industries cannot compete. They cannot export because they can't face competition from abroad and they're driven out, or exports are driven out. So that phenomena again is like a phenomenon of Dutch disease, and it's become very prevalent in some countries like Pakistan, to name one. It may have been the case in Bangladesh. It possibly is in Turkey, where you have the Turk people working in Germany, sending a lot of money back home. So that becomes a source of revenues for the government, becomes a source of sustenance for the people, and all the other industries failed to compete against remittances, like labor being exported. And by the same token, as you remember, Jagdish Bhagwati called this phenomena brain drain. That's another phenomena that's going on at the same time. So you have not only labor leaving, but maybe qualified labor is leaving, like plumbers, carpenters, engineers, scientists at a higher end. And then the domestic country is losing all this productive labor. And that phenomena was called brain drain by Jagdish Bhagwati at one time. So that's another phenomenon. And then they're sending money, which means that they're also competing out all the other industries that are unable to export.
All right. So you have worked in the US. In fact, you were the senior economist in the US Treasury. But you grew up in Pakistan. You visit regularly. You send back money. What is the story of remittances in Pakistan?
Yeah, Pakistan is a very interesting phenomenon. Okay, so essentially, of course, my case is very different. I basically came to study, no intention of staying here, no intention of sending remittances. In my case, it was reverse remittances. My parents would remit money to me to study. And the plan was that I would end up studying here and go back and be productive labor for my own country. It so happened I decided to stay because I had better job opportunities. But my parents and my relatives, luckily for us, they were not wanting of money or remittances. So I never really sent any remittances to my relatives or my parents. What I've done lately, but it's a very small amount of tool, is basically I send money to essentially poor, destitute people who are working in households in my family who may not be making enough to help them meet the cost of education for their children. So it's a very targeted use of remittance that way that I send.
It's almost like a scholarship program for needy kids.
Exactly. It's a scholarship and it's targeted assistance. Unfortunately, remittances that are sent to Pakistan are not targeted that way. They're basically sent as a general purchasing power to their relatives for their sustenance, for their livelihood, for their incomes. And what at the family level, it is a source of welfare, increase in social welfare. But at the macro level, it can become a source of impoverishment for the country, given that the country itself has certain situation or certain characteristics that worsen this whole thing.
Okay, so I'm going to push you on that because we had a brilliant conversation. In fact, we've had many great conversations over the years about how when remittances come into Pakistan, most people end up using it for consumption. Often they buy foreign goods, so the money goes out to whatever country's product they are buying. And the multiplier effect of that money is, let's say, if they buy a Mercedes, is in Germany. And if they buy an iPhone, is in the US and China, or whatever they buy. If they buy an if they buy an imported product, the money flows out. And then the other thing you told me, and this is very interesting, is how the government uses printing money to buy the dollars that come in. So walk us through the mechanics of it all, as you have many times in the past.
Okay, I think this is a very, leading question requiring a fairly detailed answer. So let's talk about Pakistan. Okay, now Pakistan is a very interesting case, but it has evolved over time. Okay, it's essentially what happened that around 1973, when oil prices shot up and the OPEC cartel was formed, a lot of money, basically petrodollars, they flowed into these Gulf states. that needed to develop their economies. They needed to build their economies. But they didn't have enough labor to be able to do large-scale infrastructure projects like roads, highways, bridges, buildings. So they started importing a lot of labor gradually, but eventually at a faster pace from the Indian subcontinent. So that phenomena started in 73 and then went up. And at this point in time, we're talking about magnitudes, close to, I would say, 2 to 3 million Pakistanis work in Saudi Arabia alone. Similarly, they work in other Gulf countries.
Like the UAE,
The
like
UAE.
Qatar, like
And
others.
this is mostly labor class, not very well educated. They are being used for building mostly, building highways, cleaning, all the lower services. So all these workers that come in to the Middle East, they send remittances. And now that remittances have become such a large amount that they are the largest source of earnings in the balance of payments in Pakistan. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing that has happened over time is that Pakistan has repeatedly continued to have budget deficits. In other words, the government has continued to spend more than it takes in because the tax base is narrow. Given those two things, the government has found it very convenient to dip into these remittances to finance their activities. So let me explain the mechanism.
So if you would not
Yeah.
mind, it would be great to explain the mechanism both on the private side. Let's say money comes in to a family. What do they do with it? Do they use it for foreign trips, or they give it to exporters, or they go and exchange it at a bank? And also the mechanics on the government side, because government, of course, needs dollars to buy stuff, whether it is arms or whether it is machinery or other products.
Sure. So essentially, let's think about it on the private side. So let's say one of the workers in the Middle East sends like $1,000 to their family. Now, the family, when they receive the $1,000, they don't receive it directly. It has to come through either a money changer or through the bank. Now, in Pakistan, there's no point in holding dollars for domestic purchases. And also, Pakistan forbids people from holding foreign currency. So when the family goes and gets the money from the money changer or from the bank, they receive it in rupees. So they get the money and then they go out and spend it. They basically spend it on their needs, depending on what part of the income spectrum they live in. Now, keep in mind that over time, because of the dust disease phenomena, because of the overvalued currency, a lot of things are imported now instead of being produced at home because they've been driven out of business, because they become expensive to produce at home.
Yeah. In fact, you showed me a paper which talks about deindustrialization in Pakistan. And that has happened consistently over the past few decades.
Exactly.
And we discussed this in another podcast about how Pakistan gradually became deindustrialized.
Exactly.
From the Ayub Khan years.
We've already done that it became deindustrialized because of that overvalued currency. Mm-hmm. Number one, remittances had a contribution, but then foreign aid, the Cold War, the U.S. assistance, all drove up the currency, drove out most of the domestic industry.
And to be fair, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's socialism didn't help. That was the final nail in the coffin.
Exactly, because that also drove all the private enterprise out. And the government came in, which became more inefficient, which became more expensive. So now there's hardly anything that I just came back from Pakistan, and there's hardly anything I could purchase, except for maybe local cotton, like dress, just as a present. Other than that, there was nothing that I could buy. Most of the things that I would see were all foreign goods at general merchant stores. So clearly, the the family that received the remittances, they go out and spend. They probably spend half of it on local produce, like food and stuff, but the other is most probably imports. So that money is going back in the form of imports, number one. Okay.
And therefore, the multiplier effect of that money will be back wherever this
Will be-
product is manufactured, as you've
Exactly.
just said.
So that, in a way, imports are greater than exports.
Yeah.
Now, number two, the government. Now, like I mentioned, the government always has a budget deficit, which means it spends more than it takes in.
Mhm.
So, and part of that spending of more than it takes in is basically foreign imports. They have to buy helicopters, armaments, all kinds of stuff that they import. So how do they get the dollars to import them? They basically get it from the banks, from the dollars that have come in through the remittances. But then how do they finance it through their rupees? The government essentially prints the money. And that is the source of another problem, which is inflation. So government is printing money to finance its deficit. It's also selling bonds, but the bonds are at a very high premium and at very high interest rates. So now Pakistan is in a bind. So although remittances are coming in, they're helping out the local population that's receiving it in terms of their sustenance, but they're also financing all these government deficits, and the government is continuing to purchase from abroad. So you've got this weird kind of disequilibrium where the country continues to be increasingly more in debt, both domestic and external debt.
Now, when you talk about this mechanism, so in the early days, of course, aid came in, remittances came in, and that overvalued the rupee and contributed to the decline of industry. But this new phenomenon of dollars coming in, leading to the Pakistani state printing more money to buy those dollars, would lead logically to a depreciation of the Pakistani rupee. The Pakistani rupee over the last 20, 30 years should have collapsed in value.
It has collapsed. For example, like 8 years ago when I went to Pakistan and I purchased rupees, $1 would get me 100 rupees. Now, this time I went, $1 was getting me 280 rupees.
Wow.
So the rupee has depreciated tremendously, partly because of that. But keep in mind, like I said, this has been a gradual phenomena over time where every aspect has played a role. Number one, remittances have, in a way, their disadvantages have ended up being more than their advantages. Encouraging people who are receiving them not to work, or encouraging emigration. So that's on one thing that's going on. At the same time, the governments are financing their deficits through the dollars that they're getting. They're getting through remittances. And now how do they finance it? When the rates are very high, they print. When I say print money, theoretically, technically, they wouldn't call it that. The way it works is that the government sells bonds to the banks. The banks buy the bonds, so give the money to the bank, to the government, but then those bonds become high-powered money. They are like reserve because they have the bonds. Those bonds are basically taken to the state bank or the central bank, and they become a source of expanding the money supply. So whenever you have a bank buying up government bonds, and then the bank is giving them to the central bank as their reserves, they are becoming high-powered money. And that increases the money supply. And that's exactly what's going on. I think in the USA, this doesn't happen, that you have a commercial bank that goes and turns over their government bonds as reserves or meet their reserve requirements. So that's the problem. So all these problems have compounded. Number one, the government continued to have budget deficits. Number two, Pakistan over time had an overvalued currency. Number three, deindustrialization. So remittances, in a way, have been a form of debt disease that they've driven out other industries. They have become a source of earnings for the government. They have become a source of livelihood for the people. And because of that, it has become deindustrialized.
Understood. But just to clarify point two, initially it appreciated the rupee, and then remittances have been a factor in the collapse in value of the rupee as well.
Well, okay, that's a good clarification. Remittances per se cannot be the source of collapsing of the rupee.
Because they exert upward pressure on the value of
They are, in a way, sustaining the trade balance.
So, but they act as a perverse incentive for the government. So it is the government's fiscal indiscipline which is spending more than it earns.
Exactly.
And that is partly because it has a huge military to support and perhaps other wasteful expenditures. But more importantly, by not taxing the elite, having a very narrow tax base, and even the upper middle class, I mean, they hardly pay any property taxes.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you pay quite a heavy whack here in Virginia.
Yes, of course. It went up again.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But the point is that leads to this colossal downward pressure on the rupee. And that is why the Pakistani rupee has gone from $1 to 100 to $1 to 280 in the span of 8 years.
Yeah.
All right. Brilliant.
Exactly. And, to keep in again, now that brings up another point that I should be clear. Ideally, remittances can be hugely beneficial to a country. Ceteris paribus. All things the same. They can be great. Think of it. This is like free foreign exchange that a country is getting.
Yeah.
It's like free foreign exchange. So now, ideally...
What can be bad about free candy?
Exactly.
Maybe diabetes in the long run.
What can be bad? If you get like free, it's like a form of saving that a country has received. And it's in terms of dollars. It's foreign currency. So what this country could do, if they were to channel it, especially the government, or even, the households, into more savings, if they were to increase savings. It depends on the distribution of income. If the government were to take that free money that has come in, and if they had a balanced budget, they could use it for productive capital. They could, in a way, spur their own. And Israel is a remarkable phenomenon.
So before we get to Israel, I want to ask you, we'll get to Israel, but before we get to Israel, I want to ask you, are there other comparable countries to Pakistan? We've spoken of Turkey, we've spoken of, say, El Salvador, but I really want to hear about the comparable countries, and then we'll get to Israel, which probably is the Norway of using remittances.
Exactly. Okay. Now, if one were to, essentially, when we're talking about remittances and other countries, Egypt is a classic case also. Turkey is a classic case where you have this phenomena of a debt disease because the government has a deficit and then you also have remittances coming in. South America, Salvador, Guatemala, any country that is exporting large amounts of labor and then they're getting these remittances, their use is not being done, prudently. It's just the way the distribution of income is and the way government finances are and the way they have evolved. So clearly, have remittances been beneficial to any country? I cannot think of, at the most, they have not been hurtful, maybe to small economies. It depends on the country, but the major economies like India is too big. So although remittances do come in, but as the size of the economy or size of their trade, they're not that much. Pakistan is a very unique case where the remittances are the largest export earner.
Same may be true for Turkey, though.
Yeah. Turkey is one.
Or maybe Turkey, tourism might be the top earner.
See, that's the other thing.
Yeah.
Other countries like Egypt and Turkey, they have tourism. Pakistan doesn't have tourism.
Well, why
Similarly,
wouldn't you
South
want to
America-
go to Pakistan? It's a lovely country, isn't it?
Yeah, but unfortunately, I didn't see many tourists there, except the Chinese, who are mostly working, developing it.
They were not quite tourists. They're workers. They're
They're
there because you have, what's that?
The CPEC.
CPAC now, the China-Pakistan corridor.
Yeah, so that I hardly saw any. I was in Islamabad, the capital of the country, and I hardly saw any foreigners, especially white foreigner. So clearly, that's the problem. Unfortunately, remittances in most countries, especially the poor countries, are not really exploited to their benefit that could emerge from them.
So let's go to Israel. You were starting to give the example of Israel, and you said if you're getting free foreign money, you could use it productively. And you said, and classic example is Israel. So walk us through a country which has used remittances, in the words of many, exceedingly judiciously.
Well, Israel doesn't receive, they probably do get remittances, but most of the money has been coming. Over the years, they used to get remittances, definitely, because, American Jews were sending money to Israel, and the USA, for example, was sending money. Like they have I think, due to I think what was that, the Camp David Accords, U.S. agreed to send $4 billion to Israel every year for economic and military assistance. Now, Israel is a country and a government that has been able to use that money for productive investment. And for that reason, their economy is very much like a Western economy. They have balanced budget. They were having a problem initially. Same problem, when they were getting all these remittances and they didn't know what to do with these things. But over time, they've developed a mechanism and the industry has expanded and the agriculture has expanded. So they've been able to
services too. They've expanded services too. Their software is top notch.
They've been able to utilize that foreign aid in a very sensible way, because I think the people were educated and there were maybe more equal distribution of income. That probably was a big factor that helped Israel. Better education, better distribution of income, and then better finances.
They make a 2-year budget, which is very wise. They plan further out in the future than most countries.
Exactly. And then there's a democracy. They're a parliamentary democracy in the true sense of the word, unlike other countries like Pakistan. Pakistan is not really a democracy. So, and it's dictated by the military. Everyone knows. So for that reason, the government is not even able to spend the right way because the military takes the major share of the budget. And the military hardware is a foreign exchange drain on the economy. So that's another thing. Turkey is an example too, military. Egypt is an example, military. So they use the remittances to get the military hardware and stuff and finance the deficits.
Yeah. But to be fair, Israel spends a lot on its military too. However, as you've pointed out, they've developed their industry and they make a lot of their own weapons. And in fact, they now are a big exporter of weapons too.
Exactly. Yeah. So because of their industrial base,
correct,
their education, qualified people, they've been able to do all that. Absolutely.
So I have my final question for you now. What are the best policy measures to handle remittances? And I ask because you have been a policymaker for decades. And so I want you to put on your US Treasury hat and tell us and tell some of our listeners who may be policymakers as to what can you do?
Okay. Again, it has different answers for different countries. Clearly, Israel appears to be doing the right thing. They do get foreign aid, they do get remittances, and they're able to channel it because the distribution of income is more even. It's because the economic policy making is more institutionalized. It's because they've already developed over time. So clearly, that's a different case altogether, because they've come a long way. Now, for countries like Pakistan, for example, the first thing that the government would have to do is to balance its budget. As long as the government does not balance the budget, regardless of remittances, that's one big problem that is sucking the remittances right away without any use.
But balancing the budget is hard. Even the US is finding it hard. France is finding it hard. Even Germany is finding it hard. That seems to be a problem plaguing democracies today.
That is true. But these problems in USA, France, and even Germany, these are different because these are AAA rated countries. So when they have deficits, they can go out and borrow by selling bonds at very low rates. And as long as the rates that they're paying, the government is paying, the nominal rates are less than the growth in the economy, the government can sustain those kind of deficits. Because the interest payments that they're making are less than the revenues that they're generating, the primary balance that they have that can pay off the interest and principal. In the case of Pakistan, this is not the case. Number one, they are like C-rated countries with very high rates, international rates. So
the cost of debt is expensive. Therefore, they should cut down their debt instead of issuing new debt to pay back old debt.
They do not have the luxury to have deficits. Countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, they do not have that luxury to have deficits or debt, increased debt. Because the debt, especially foreign debt, is even worse. Because when the rupee depreciates, you have to pay the foreign debt in dollars. That means it'll take more rupees to pay. And that how you're going to get more rupees except by printing the money.
So you're in a vicious cycle.
You're in a vicious circle. And vicious cycle, exactly. So policy recommendation, first of all, is remittances by themselves are not hurtful. It is the conditions of the country. So I think that's the point that I wanted to make, is that remittances per se are like candy. They're great. Okay. What effects do they have? Well, clearly one effect they can have is if you're already deindustrialized, then they can't really solve that problem because they're going to increase the value of your currency. So that is one negative impact that remittances have, that they tend to put an upward pressure on the local currency. So as a policymaker, one should take that into account. Make sure that a dust disease doesn't emerge.
So if remittances come in, number one, run a balanced budget, cut out your deficits.
Yeah.
Number two, if the money comes in, use it for productive use, use it to build bridges, roads, railways, educate your people.
Exactly.
And not buy the latest champagne bottle or the fancy Mercedes.
Or, like foreign food for your cat.
Okay, even better. All right. I think we've come to the end of our podcast, unless you have anything enlightening to say.
Yeah, I think we've come to the end. Basically, what I wanted to say is we shouldn't let anyone think that remittances per se are a bad thing. Clearly, at the individual level, they're a good thing. They're like a free lunch. It depends on what the economy uses it for.
Excellent. So those of you who've been hearing this and want to write a paper on this topic with Nasir, reach out to us. We'll connect you with him. If you're a young, ambitious economist anywhere in the world, you have a chance to write with an experienced economist. And make sure you follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Of course, we are there on the website too. So sign up for our newsletter at www.fairobserver.com. We also have an app. So without further ado, I wish you all the best. Signing off from Virginia on a summer evening in April, it's Atul Singh. Thank you, Nasir.
Thank you.